Almost 10 years ago, freshly graduated from high school, I came across a little book known by The Fault in Our Stars. Now, I'm not gonna lie, back then it was kind of a nuisance for me. Everyone just wouldn't stop talking about it, especially by the time the movie adaptation was announced, so I couldn't help but be curious. I was free to read, and I'll admit for some reason I thought it could gain me some extra riz, like today's kids say. But honestly, it wasn't a bad book. It was actually great, especially by today's standards, where every corner of a bookstore is now piled with frickin' Colleen Hoover. John Green actually turned out to be a wholesome dude. He's not only a capable writer, but he also created content on YouTube way before it was cool. So I read the book and later watched the movie, and I loved both. Now, I can't say it was a groundbreaking flick. It wasn't exactly a walk to remember or The Notebook, but it was beautiful and heartbreaking. However, the one thing that made it stand out to me was the part where a Dutch author by the name of Peter van Houten was mentioned. You know, this guy. Now, the protagonist, Hazel, mentions his book, An Imperial Affliction, and immediately upon reading that part, I went and googled his name. And to my surprise, he did not exist. He and his book were all fictional, which was strangely amusing. I mean, naturally and surely we're all interested in reading that book, but we shouldn't overlook the whole point and aesthetic of this special literary device. The fact I assumed it was real tells you how much it felt so natural and subtle. It's a refreshing way of presenting parallels or symbolic and psychological significance for the characters. Instead of depending on name drops and already established works, authors just flex their creativity and give us new dimensions and add even more depth to their stories. That is our topic for today in Mind Palace. If you've watched my video about intertextuality, or if you already know enough about it, then you understand that it is a device used to create texts by using other texts. In layman terms, it's referencing a given work, event, or culture which already exists in reality with a new one. Of course, it cannot work unless the reader is familiar with the context. Otherwise, the meaning would be completely lost.
I am so powerful. My mind, it amazes me sometimes. I should have an octane.
You'd understand what is meant when a character is referred to as Sherlock, but you wouldn't get it if you have never read or watched a Sherlock work before. Now, embedded narratives are complete diversion. You see, whereas intertextuality is building on already established texts, this one is starting completely from scratch, literally. This is why I'm calling it the Antithesis. You could almost say that this device poses as intertextuality while it actually doesn't reference a work from real life, but instead from the world of the narrative itself. To simplify in an example, when you see this, you will pause and you'll Google it and find this. That way you'll understand the context. But when you see this, search for it and you'll find this. What do you do then? Well, you'll either read the wiki page or do the more reasonable thing, which is to be patient and dig into the story further to find out. And that's what makes it special. It stimulates your curiosity to know more about the work itself, instead of dependent on your knowledge about other established works. In this video, we'll discuss all forms of embedded narratives. As you will see, I took liberty in breaking it down into types. It was hard because half of the concepts here are based on my intuitive research and analysis, but I trust that while this may not be academic, it will still give you a fair insight. I will list these forms and compare each one to its equivalent in intertextuality, just to furthermore understand how it plays against the rules. Disclaimer though, this video isn't implying that one of these is necessarily better than the other. Both are effective when used properly. It's just a good old comparative discussion to understand more about either. What is embedded narratives? The Fault in Our Stars example was by no means the first time I encountered this device. It only made me more directly aware of it. In fact, we've all been seeing it everywhere, in series, cartoons, and movies, and I mostly remember them from video games. And it makes sense, because the medium depends on it. When you look at it, an embedded narrative is the second layer or level of story. Early in the development of a video game, there's the game mechanics, the main purpose of the playability of that game, and then the developers add in stories. And generally, that's how all stories go. We have the main narrative, and then we add in secondary narratives. That's why we say embedded. There are stories within stories. It is worth mentioning that framed narratives may be the most classical form of our subject. It's basically a story about a character telling us another story within, except this video will not dive into that type, because that one is more about the shift of narrators and points of views. Needless to say, you won't be hearing any talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. If you want to know more about framed narratives though, you should check out Miss Hans's video on the topic. It's a very simplified and fun peek at this type of structure. But yeah, in this video, we won't be focusing on any kind of secondary narratives, but a very specific set of forms, regardless of who the narrator is. Stick around and you'll understand. So starting off by the most common and recognizable form we have, and that is embedded literature. To clarify, when I say literature, I'm referring to all forms of written work, including film scripts. Now, we already know that authors and filmmakers love to embellish their works by referencing other books and movies. They not only incorporate them to simply give a shout out, but also with the purpose of providing a symbol within the overall plot or a parallel to the protagonist's arc.
Monte Cristo picture?
In Park Chan-wook's masterpiece Old Boy, the protagonist's journey of revenge is compared to that of Edmond Dante's from the Count of Monte Cristo. It's a subtle reference because you'd have to have read the book in order to understand the comparison. But with embedded narratives, a literary or cinematic work is entirely fictional and will exist exclusively inside that fiction.
I heard you did a pilot.
It was a show about a team of female secret agents called Fox Force 5.
Similarly to this example, sometimes they only serve as a prop in the universe, a facade of the fiction inside the story, and they are more often made grotesque just to allow the viewer or reader to differentiate it from the reality of that story.
Get the freaking cop! Your trial will be held at the city morgue.
But other times they serve a much deeper purpose, just like an imperial affliction in The Fault in Our Stars. Hazel finds solace in this book and uses it to cope with her disease, relating with its main character, Anna. John Green could have easily looked for an established work with a similar story and simply referenced it, but it wouldn't be as unique and specifically crafted as the one he created, especially that the author of the book is an important character that will play a strong part in changing Hazel's view of life. It would be tasteless, let alone impossible, to find a real-life author that can play a drunken, hard-hitting, and depressed person. And since there's literature, of course we'll have music too. Now, whenever you watch a movie or play a game and you hear a musical piece that isn't part of the original soundtrack being played in story, your wildest guess is that it must be some song by a known artist that you can't wait to check their work.
Smith?
When I first watched this scene, I later searched up the Smiths and enjoyed a marathon across their discography. And there are many other examples of this, where there's a song or poem in a movie or book which are familiar or new to you. But then there are instances such as this one. If this band were real, I would be blasting their entire albums on repeat. And as frustrating as it is to realize their music video is fictional, you can't help but appreciate the effort put into the intro of this movie. It's a catchy and accurate callback to the 80s style. I just believe that this guy Alex used to be a real star and now he is a has-been who's struggling to make a comeback. And we could include pretty much all musicals into this category, but let's not forget authors that incorporate some poetry in their prose. The best examples can be found in medieval fantasy works like The Hobbit's Misty Mountains by J.R.R. Tolkien or Game of Thrones' Reigns of Castamere by George R.R. Martin. This kind of narrative gives life to these universes. It adds additional depth in the way characters in this world behave and react to their reality, which shapes a fully realized culture and history. Speaking of history, there's a reason historical fiction became a whole separate genre. And again, it doesn't only concern literature, but also theater, cinema, television, and even video games. Notice that we're not saying fictional history, but rather historical fiction, meaning that it is normally a fictional plot taking place in the setting of a particular real historical event. Sure, the authors sometimes take liberty in depicting the events their own way and even add speculations and fill gaps, but fundamentally it is entirely intertextual and borrowed from real history. It is also worth noting that Norse and Greek mythologies and other religious narratives are historical as well. Whether or not there's a consensus on their realism, they're still part of our world. And they don't have one overarching author, they are passed down through generations and referenced by an endless number of authors. Fictional history is a different story though. With these narratives, the author is creating whole new events and incidents, either recorded somehow in the story or told by characters. This history is essentially what constitutes the basic lore.
Water. Earth. Fire.
Lore is simply the backstory, history, and world-building elements that make up the story's universe. The lore is meant to explain the origins, the knowledge, legends, and traditions behind the characters and settings of a fictional universe. Some universes are of dystopian and futuristic nature, and others are typical medieval fantasy. George Orwell's 1984 is among the very first and most popular dystopian fictions, with one of the richest fictional universes, Oceania. Orwell created a whole history of war, governmental system, and technology behind the story, which, although could be interpreted as predictions, never existed in the reality of that time. Another easy example from medieval fantasy would be the universe of Middle-earth from The Lord of the Rings. Bear with me, as you're gonna hear a lot about this series specifically, because it truly is the epitome of embedded narratives. Tolkien did not only create a simple story, but a whole universe with its laws, cultures, and history. He formed a specific background story about almost each character, item, and culture. He even has a story behind the creation of Middle-earth itself. And with all these details, you'd think he would create a good reason why they wouldn't write the... I'm just kidding, never mind. Let's not forget that the fictional religions and mythologies, inspired as they are from reality, such as the cult of Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft's work. There's also the following of the Lord of the Light and A Song of Ice and Fire. And there's the Unitology from the Dead Space video game series. I did intend to make geography as a whole separate type of embedded narrative, but it makes more sense to just include it in the history section. You see, part of the lore of any story is the geographical location. On one hand, we would find most stories set in familiar locations, like New York City, Victorian England, or even feudal Japan. But then there are fictional locations such as Westeros, Gotham City, Krypton, and obviously Middle-earth. Overall, when authors put that much effort into creating not only fictional characters and events, but unique new locations and cultures, you can't help but be immersed inside that universe and really lose yourself learning more about it. Next up, we have language. You're not truly a sophisticated author if you haven't used at least one secondary language in one of your works. English language writers particularly can't help but throw a bit of French or Latin sentences in their writings, and most of the time they won't bother translating it, so you would go research that text if you don't already know it. But you know what's cooler? Inventing your own language. It's officially known as conlang, or constructed language. It can easily be its very own type of embedded narratives. Now, if you know enough about Lord of the Rings, then you know that Tolkien did not start writing the stories until he finished constructing the language. He actually invented his own long before he even created the universe of Middle-earth.
I first began seriously to invent languages about I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really.
Now, of course, he's far from being the first to ever create a conlang, but he is the first author that came up with a fully fleshed out linguistic system.
That stands for Ellen, Sila, Lumen, or Menti Elvo.
Look, I could talk all day about the branches of languages that aren't in The Lord of the Rings, but I wouldn't do half the job that Lindsay Ellis does on her video on Storied, so definitely check that out. Now, the immense amount of work that Tolkien put into his craft inspired plenty more examples of conlang later on, in not only books but films and TV shows, of which most recently is the Dothraki language in Game of Thrones. Although George R.R. Martin only briefly outlined that language in the books, the showrunners actually hired professional linguists to build a whole system around it. Even video games took inspiration from Tolkien's work, like Skyrim, where the ancient dragon language plays a crucial part of the game mechanics and story overall.
Dov Walan Farel, we were made to dominate.
So to be invested in a universe with a tailor-made language system that encompasses a whole vernacular of terms and names is a breath of fresh air and, quite simply, fun. Finally, we have embedded advertisements and products. Now we're no strangers to product placements in film and TV shows, and let's be honest, most of the times they are obviously paid blatant commercials. But when they're not trying to promote a product, they are there to make a commentary or a critique about consumerism. But another way for critiquing, which is quirkier, funnier, and much less to the nose, is to create a totally make-believe product.
Vincent, you ever had a big kahuna burger? Want a bite? They're real tasty.
The subtlety completely throws you off as a viewer when you think you really want to try out that product before realizing it doesn't even exist. To be fair, it is a good resort for authors that want to avoid copyright strikes, but at times there are clear parodies of advertisement culture. I mean, just this scene right here never gets old.
Why don't you let me fix you some of this new mococo drink? All natural cocoa beans from the upper slopes of Mountain Nicaragua, no artificial sweeteners.
What the hell are you talking about?
You gotta give it to the authors that took time to create concepts and logos just to slip in a commentary, or like the rest of the embedded elements, add even more depth to the universe they're presenting.
Wow!
Now to conclude, I'm going to double down on my disclaimer earlier. I have no authority to tell you that either of these two is better than the other. I know I went harsh on intertextuality in my other video, but for good reason. Both can be very artistically satisfying when they are used properly. And personally, I think there's a right time and place for each one. Just as it wouldn't have made sense for John Green to use a work from real life, it would equally not make sense for Chuck Palahniuk to just create fictional products to make his point about consumerism. However, if you ask me, I can't help but find myself leaning more towards fantasy works with entirely fictional elements. I guess you could blame it on my escapism, but I just admire the extra effort and creativity. It truly immortalizes your work. With all the material you're giving your fans, from history to backgrounds to new terms and concepts, they will never stop theorizing about your stories, creating wiki pages dedicated to that universe. And yes, on the downside, writing some terrible fanfiction. But the point stands. Embedded narratives distinguishes your work from the rest, without having to stand on other successful works. At least on the surface, I know there's no escape from influence, Pomo and all. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hi there. If you like the video, click the like button. I mean, that's the point, I guess. And please do subscribe and share if it's not much to ask. I'm still struggling to keep my content consistent. My videos already take long enough to make, so I appreciate those who stick around anyhow. So again, thank you very much for your attention and adios.